Welcome to Midnight Truth, where peaceful stories guide you into the perfect night's rest. Before we start, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps me bring more soothing stories to you and others who need them. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, find your cozy spot, close your eyes, and let's begin this calming journey together. The movers left hours ago, and I'm finally alone in this old house. It's strange how quiet it gets once everyone's gone, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling into place. The realtor called it charming and full of character, which is realtor speak for old and probably haunted. But I needed a fresh start after everything that happened, and this place was within my budget, a miracle in itself. I spent most of the afternoon unpacking the essentials, clothes, toiletries, enough kitchen stuff to make a decent meal. The master bedroom's on the second floor, overlooking what must have been a beautiful garden once. Now it's just overgrown weeds and a rusted swing set that creaks in the wind. Every time I look out the window, I expect to see children playing there, but the yard remains stubbornly empty. The house smells like dust and old wood, with a faint undertone of something sweet. Lavender maybe, or lilacs. It's not unpleasant, just odd, like the previous owners tried to mask something with air freshener. The walls are papered with faded floral patterns that curl the edges, and the wooden floor's grown underfoot no matter how lightly I step. There's a draft, too, always moving through the halls, making the sheer curtains flutter even when all the windows are closed. My first night here, I couldn't sleep, not because of any supernatural nonsense, just the unfamiliar sounds of an old house settling. The pipes moaned like they were in pain, and every few minutes, I'd hear what sounded like footsteps overhead, though I knew I was alone. Twice I got up to check, flashlight in hand, only to find nothing but empty rooms and shadowy corners that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Work starts tomorrow at the local library, and I'm both excited and terrified. Excited because it's a chance to start over, to meet new people who don't know about my divorce or the mess I left behind in Chicago. Terrified because small towns breed gossip faster than mold in a damp basement. And I've already caught a few neighbors peeking through their curtains when I pulled up in the moving truck. Still, I made myself walk around the block this afternoon, trying to seem friendly and approachable. Most people just nodded politely and kept walking, but Mrs. Hargrove from across the street actually stopped to chat. She's ancient, with skin like parchment and eyes that seem to see right through you. Her house looks like something out of fairy tale. White picket fence, flower boxes overflowing with petunias. But her smile didn't quite reach those sharp eyes. "You're in the old Thompson place," she said, not bothering with introductions. "Good bones, that house, but it's had its share of trouble." Then she launched into a story about how the last tenant ran screaming into the street one night, babbling about curses and dark figures in the corners of rooms. The police found her wandering Main Street in her nightgown, completely unhinged. Apparently, she's still in the psychiatric ward upstate. I laughed it off, of course. People love their ghost stories, especially in places like this where nothing exciting ever happens. But later, as I was putting away dishes in the kitchen, I noticed something odd. The air felt heavier near the back door, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. And there was a smell, different from the lavender scent lingering throughout the house. This was metallic, almost like blood, but when I checked the door, there was nothing there. Now I'm sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that's gone cold, listening to the house settle around me. The grandfather clock in the hallway strikes midnight, each chime echoing through the empty rooms. For the first time since moving here, I wonder if taking this place sight unseen was a mistake. But it's too late now. The lease is signed, the deposit paid. All I can do is hope that Mrs. Hargrove was just spinning yarns to scare the new girl. The upstairs bathroom faucet drips steadily, despite my attempt to tighten it earlier. Each drop sounds impossibly loud in the silence, like someone tapping on glass from the other side. I should go to bed. I need to be well rested for my first day at work. But something keeps me rooted to this chair, staring at the shadows stretching across the cracked linoleum floor. Something tells me that tonight won't be any easier than last night. Morning came too quickly, dragging me from uneasy dreams of dark corridors and whispering voices. The sunlight streaming through the thin curtains looked almost mocking against a heavy feeling in my chest. As I showered, the water pressure fluctuated wildly between scalding hot and ice cold, forcing me to finish quickly. When I stepped out, the mirror was fogged over, but something about the condensation pattern caught my eye. It looked almost like writing, though it disappeared before I could make sense of it. Walking to work, I passed Mrs. Hargrove again. This time she was watering her flowers, though they didn't seem to need it. "Careful with that house," she called out, her voice carrying an edge that made me pause. The Thompsons weren't right, always locking themselves in that study upstairs. Some say they open doors best left shut. She gave me a meaningful look before turning back to her plants, leaving me standing there with goosebumps rising on my arms. The library proved to be a charming old building, its stone facade covered in ivy that rattled gently in the breeze. Inside, the air smelled of old books and polished wood. My supervisor, Margaret, was a kind woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and glasses perpetually perched on her nose. She showed me around, introduced me to the other staff members, and explained my duties with patient detail. Everyone seemed nice enough, though I caught them exchanging knowing glances when Margaret mentioned where I lived. During my lunch break, I wandered down Main Street, taking in the quaint shops and cafes. That's when I met Thomas, who runs the local antique store. His shop window displayed an impressive collection of vintage items, but it was the old books that caught my attention. He greeted me warmly, his eyes twinkling behind round glasses. "You're the one living in the Thompson house, aren't you?" he asked, not unkindly. "Don't let Mrs. Hargrove scare you too much. She loves her stories." Thomas invited me in, showing me around his cluttered shop. We talked about books for a while. He had excellent taste, and somehow ended up discussing the house. The Thompsons were peculiar, he admitted, carefully arranging a stack of leather-bound volumes. They dabbled in things most folks wouldn't understand. Occult practices, rituals, that sort of thing. Town legend says they summoned something they couldn't control. He chuckled, but it sounded forced. Of course, that's just local superstition. That evening, as I prepared dinner in the kitchen, I noticed something strange. The radio I brought from Chicago kept tuning itself to static-filled stations. Every time I adjusted it, the dial would slowly creep back to a frequency filled with white noise and faint, indecipherable whispers. Frustrated, I unplugged it, but the sound continued, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Following it led me to the study upstairs, a room I'd avoided until now. The study door stood slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd closed it after my initial exploration. Inside, the air felt thick and cold, like stepping into a freezer. The wallpaper here was darker, peeling at the corners to reveal strange symbols drawn directly on the plaster beneath. They reminded me of something Thomas had shown me in his shop, an occult text he claimed dated back to the 1600s. In the center of the room sat an old desk, its surface scarred with deep scratches that looked almost deliberate. As I reached out to touch the desk, the temperature dropped suddenly. My breath misted in the air, and I heard a sound behind me, a soft, wet dragging noise like bare feet on hardwood. Whipping around, I saw nothing but shadows dancing in the dim light, filtering through the grimy window. The noise stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my own rapid breathing. I fled the room, slamming the door shut behind me, and vowing never to enter again. Back in the kitchen, I tried to shake off the encounter by focusing on dinner. But the house seemed different now, more alive somehow. The creaks and groans took on a rhythm, almost like breathing. The scent of lavender had been replaced by something else. Dirt and decay, like opening an ancient tomb. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. Later, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I became aware of another sound. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then I realized it was coming from inside the walls. A scratching noise, rhythmic and purposeful, moving slowly along the baseboards. It paused outside my bedroom door, and I held my breath, heart pounding in my ears. The doorknob began to turn, inch by inch, though I knew I'd locked it. Just as it clicked open, I switched on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. Nothing was there, The hallway beyond remained empty, though I could have sworn I heard a soft chuckle as the door swung shut by itself. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone and texted Thomas, asking if we could meet for coffee tomorrow. If anyone knew more about the house's history, it would be him. Until then, I planned to keep all the lights on and stay far away from that study. The rest of the night passed in tense vigilance. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow suspicious. By morning, exhaustion had settled into my bones, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The house wasn't just old and creaky, it was alive, and whatever dwelled within had taken notice of me. The days blurred together in an exhausting cycle of work, restless nights, and growing paranoia. At the library, I threw myself into cataloging and shelving, grateful for distraction. Margaret noticed my fatigue, but attributed it to adjusting to a new job in town. "Give it time," she advised kindly. "These old houses take some getting used to." If only she knew. Each night followed the same disturbing pattern. Around 11, the house would come alive with sounds that defied explanation. Footsteps paced the upstairs hallway, sometimes accompanied by soft muttering. The study door would creak open, no matter how many times I wedged it shut. Once, I woke to find my name being whispered from the darkness, a voice that sounded disturbingly familiar yet impossible to place. During daylight hours, I documented everything in a notebook, hoping logic would dispel my fear. The entries grew increasingly frantic. 11:14 p.m., scratching in walls, south wall of bedroom. 11:47 p.m., cold spot near study door. Temperature dropped 15 degrees in seconds. Midnight, radio tuned itself to static again, louder this time. Beside each entry, I sketched the symbols I'd seen on the study walls, though they seemed to change slightly each time I looked at them. Thomas proved to be an invaluable resource. Over endless cups of coffee at the local diner, he shared what he knew about the Thompsons. Ezekiel Thompson was obsessed with contacting the dead, he explained, pushing his glasses up his nose. Lost his wife and daughter to influenza in 1918. After that, he became fixated. Spent years studying ancient texts, performing rituals. He slid a book across the table, a leather-bound volume with pages yellowed and brittle. Found this in the attic of an estate sale. Thought you might find it interesting. The book contained detailed accounts of seances and ceremonies, complete with diagrams matching the symbols in the study. Some passages described opening portals to other realms, while others warned of consequences for disturbing the natural order. One page, heavily annotated in Thompson's spidery handwriting, detailed a ritual meant to anchor transient spirits to mortal plane. The final entry was dated just days before his mysterious disappearance. Armed with this knowledge, I became more methodical in my observations. I set up a basic monitoring system using my phone and laptop, recording audio and video throughout the house. The results were chilling. On playback, I could see shadowy figures moving just out of frame, hear voices whispering in languages I couldn't identify. One clip showed the study door opening by itself, revealing movement inside, though the footage cut to static whenever the camera focused directly on the room. My research extended beyond the house itself. At the county records office, I discovered unsettling patterns among previous tenants. Many reported similar disturbances, though few were willing to speak openly about them. One family had moved out after their youngest child began drawing disturbing pictures of the man in the walls. Another tenant claimed to have recorded EVP, electronic voice phenomena, that spoke directly to her by name. Most troubling was a consistent mention of a figure described as not quite human, often seen in reflections or peripheral vision. Despite mounting evidence, part of me clung to rational explanations. Maybe the house was built on unstable ground, causing unusual acoustics. Perhaps the symbols were merely decorative, their resemblance to occult markings coincidental. Yet these theories failed to explain the physical manifestations. The icy breath on my neck as I worked late at night, the feeling of invisible fingers brushing against my skin, the absolute certainty that something watched me from the darkness. Thomas helped me set up more sophisticated recording equipment, teaching me to analyze the data properly. Whatever's here, he warned, it's intelligent. It knows we're looking for it. His words sent shivers down my spine. especially after reviewing footage that showed books falling from shelves in response to my presence, or lights flickering in perfect sync with my movements through the house. The hardest part was maintaining normalcy during the day. At work, I pasted on a smile and answered patrons' questions about overdue books and interlibrary loans. Neighbors waved hello as I retrieved my mail, oblivious to the terror that gripped me each night. Even Mrs. Hargrove seemed unaware of how deeply her warnings had affected me, though she occasionally appeared at her window, watching as I came and went. By the end of the week, I'd established a routine of sorts. Mornings were for work and research, afternoons for meeting with Thomas and gathering information, evenings for setting up recording equipment and documenting new occurrences. Nights were pure endurance, each one bringing increasingly aggressive activity, the entity, because I could no longer deny that's what it was, seemed to feed on my fear, growing bolder with each passing day. One particularly disturbing discovery came when I examined the basement more thoroughly. Behind a false panel in the wall, I found a collection of journals belonging to Ezekiel Thompson. Their contents confirmed everything Thomas had told me and more. Thompson had succeeded in opening a portal, but something had come through that he hadn't anticipated. His final entries were barely legible, filled with pleas for forgiveness and warnings about the thing that watches from the threshold. As I read through the journals, a cold realization settled over me. The disturbances weren't random. They were escalating according to a pattern Thompson had documented decades ago. Each phase brought the entity closer to full manifestation, culminating in something he referred to only as the crossing. According to his calculations, I had less than 2 weeks before whatever lurked in my house would become unstoppable. The journals revealed more than I wanted to know. Thompson's meticulous notes describe how the house itself had become a conduit, its very structure imbued with energy from the other side. "The walls breathe," he wrote in cramped handwriting, "and with each exhalation comes a fragment of what lies beyond." He documented how the house seemed to pulse with life, its walls expanding and contracting imperceptibly, creating the illusion of breathing. The more I read, the more I understood why the air felt so heavy, why the house always seemed warmer than it should be. Certain areas of the house were marked in Thompson's journals as convergence points, places where the barrier between worlds thinned dangerously. The study was one, naturally, but others included the landing at the top of the stairs, a corner of the basement where the foundation stones didn't quite align, and surprisingly, the small closet under the main staircase. These spots grew colder as night approached, sometimes dropping 20 degrees in minutes. The temperature shifts created condensation on the walls, forming patterns that resembled faces when viewed from certain angles. The house reacted to my presence differently than it had to previous occupants. According to Thompson's observations, the entity typically remained dormant until a new resident moved in, then gradually increased its activity over months. In my case, it had escalated alarmingly fast, within days. The journal suggested this acceleration might be linked to the fact that I'd moved in precisely 70 years after Thompson's disappearance, completing some cosmic cycle he'd inadvertently set in motion. Most disturbing were the documented interactions between the entity and its victims. Thompson described how it would mimic voices of loved ones, create illusions of familiar faces and mirrors, and even manipulate objects to appear helpful. One entry detailed how it had pretended to be his deceased daughter, leading him to the study where it trapped him overnight. The entity seemed particularly adept at exploiting personal vulnerabilities, something that explained why I kept hearing my ex-husband's voice call my name, though I knew he was hundreds of miles away. Thomas helped me cross-reference Thompson's findings with other cases of haunting phenomena. We discovered alarming parallels in the behavior patterns, the gradual escalation, the manipulation of environmental factors, the psychological targeting of victims' weaknesses. What set this entity apart was its apparent intelligence. It learned from each interaction, adapting its tactics to maximize fear and confusion. The journals noted how it would observe silently for periods, then launch increasingly complex attacks that played on the victim's deepest fears. The house's architecture itself seemed designed to enhance these effects. The angled ceilings created natural echo chambers, amplifying sounds and making it impossible to pinpoint their origin. The placement of windows and doors created optical illusions that made rooms appear larger or smaller, depending on the time of day. Even the floor plan seemed calculated to disorient, dead ends where none should exist, hallways that curved slightly without warning. Thompson had documented how these features contributed to a constant state of unease, keeping occupants perpetually off balance. As I delved deeper into the journals, I began noticing patterns in the entity's behavior. It preferred stormy nights, when electricity in the air seemed to empower it. Its manifestations always started with subtle changes, the lavender scent intensifying, the creaking floorboards falling into rhythmic patterns, the shadows stretching longer than physics allowed. Then came more overt signs, objects moving, doors opening, cold spots forming. Finally, if left unchecked, it would attempt direct contact, though Thompson warned that these encounters often drove people mad. The journals also revealed the entity's limitations. It couldn't manifest fully in daylight, explaining why its activities intensified after sunset. Certain materials, iron, salt, running water, seemed to repel it temporarily. Thompson had experimented with protective circles and wards, some of which I found drawn in chalk in hidden corners of the house. Unfortunately, his notes indicated that these measures only delayed the inevitable. The entity always found ways to circumvent them eventually. Perhaps most chilling was Thompson's observation about the house's role in containing the entity. While it served as a gateway, it also acted as a prison, preventing the entity from spreading beyond its walls. This explained why previous tenants had experienced such intense phenomena, but neighbors reported nothing unusual. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a vessel, and I was living inside it. Each revelation made the house feel more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing heavier with each passing day. I found myself avoiding the convergence points, though the entity seemed to enjoy herding me toward them. It would create distractions elsewhere in the house, loud crashes, sudden temperature drops, then cut off my escape routes until I had no choice but to pass through one of the dangerous areas. These encounters left me shaken, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. Thomas warned me about burning out, about letting fear consume me completely. You're dealing with something ancient and powerful, he cautioned during one of our increasingly frequent meetings. But it's not invincible. Knowledge is your best weapon. Still, I could see the worry in his eyes, the way he hesitated before entering the house when we reviewed recordings or examined new evidence. He believed me, trusted my observations, but that didn't mean he wasn't afraid too. By the end of the week, I could predict the entity's movements with disturbing accuracy. It followed a precise schedule, building tension throughout the evening before unleashing its full power after midnight. The manifestations always started in the study, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. I began timing them, documenting every detail in hopes of finding a weakness. But with each passing night, the entity grew stronger, its presence more palpable, its intentions clearer. The house had become a living thing, its heartbeat synchronized with mine. The entity knew my fears, my secrets, my regrets. It whispered them in the dark, twisted them into nightmares that... False panel on the wall. I found a collection of journals belonging to Ezekiel Thompson. Their contents confirmed everything Thomas had told me and more. Thompson had succeeded in opening a portal, but something had come through that he hadn't anticipated. His final entries were barely legible, filled with pleas for forgiveness and warnings about the thing that watches from the threshold. As I read through the journals, a cold realization settled over me. The disturbances weren't random. They were escalating according to a pattern Thompson had documented decades ago. Each phase brought the entity closer to full manifestation, culminating in something he referred to only as the crossing. According to his calculations, I had less than 2 weeks before whatever lurked in my house would become unstoppable. The journals revealed more than I wanted to know. Thompson's meticulous notes describe how the house itself had become a conduit, its very structure imbued with energy from the other side. The walls breathe, he wrote in cramped handwriting, and with each exhalation comes a fragment of what lies beyond. He documented how the house seemed to pulse with life, its walls expanding and contracting imperceptibly, creating an illusion of breathing. The more I read, the more I understood why the air felt so heavy, why the house always seemed warmer than it should be. Certain areas of the house were marked in Thompson's journals as convergence points, places where the barrier between worlds thinned dangerously. The study was one, naturally, but others included the landing at the top of the stairs, a corner of the basement where the foundation stones didn't quite align, and surprisingly, the small closet under the main staircase. These spots grew colder as night approached, sometimes dropping 20 degrees in minutes. The temperature shifts created condensation on the walls, forming patterns that resemble faces when viewed from certain angles. The house reacted to my presence differently than it had to previous occupants. According to Thompson's observations, the entity typically remained dormant until a new resident moved in, then gradually increased its activity over months. In my case, it had escalated alarmingly fast, within days. The journal suggested this acceleration might be linked to the fact that I'd moved in precisely 70 years after Thompson's disappearance, completing some cosmic cycle he'd inadvertently set in motion. Most disturbing were the documented interactions between the entity and its victims. Thompson described how it would mimic voices of loved ones, create illusions of familiar faces in mirrors, and even manipulate objects to appear helpful. One entry detailed how it had pretended to be his deceased daughter, leading him to the study where it trapped him overnight. The entity seemed particularly adept at exploiting personal vulnerabilities, something that explained why I kept hearing my ex-husband's voice calling my name, though I knew he was hundreds of miles away. Thomas helped me cross-reference Thompson's findings with other cases of haunting phenomena. We discovered alarming parallels in the behavior patterns, the gradual escalation, the manipulation of environmental factors, the psychological targeting of victims' weaknesses. What set this entity apart was its apparent intelligence. It learned from each interaction, adapting its tactics to maximize fear and confusion. The journals noted how it would observe silently for periods, then launch increasingly complex attacks that played on the victim's deepest fears. The house's architecture itself seemed designed to enhance these effects. The angled ceilings created natural echo chambers, amplifying sounds and making it impossible to pinpoint their origin. The placement of windows and doors created optical illusions that made rooms appear larger or smaller, depending on the time of day. Even the floor plan seemed calculated to disorient. Dead ends where none should exist, hallways that curved slightly without warning. Thompson had documented how these features contributed to a constant state of unease, keeping occupants perpetually off balance. As I delved deeper into the journals, I began noticing patterns in the entity's behavior. It preferred stormy nights, when the electricity in the air seemed to empower it. Its manifestations always started with subtle changes, the lavender scent intensifying, the creaking floorboards falling into rhythmic patterns, the shadows stretching longer than physics allowed. Then came more overt signs, objects moving, doors opening, cold spots forming. Finally, if left unchecked, it would attempt direct contact, though Thompson warned that these encounters often drove people mad. The journals also reveal the entity's limitations. It couldn't manifest fully in daylight, explaining why its activities intensified after sunset. Certain materials, iron, salt, running water, seemed to repel it temporarily. Thompson had experimented with protective circles and wards, some of which I found drawn in chalk in hidden corners of the house. Unfortunately, his notes indicated that these measures only delayed the inevitable. The entity always found ways to circumvent them eventually. Perhaps most chilling was Thompson's observation about the house's role in containing the entity. While it served as a gateway, it also acted as a prison, preventing the entity from spreading beyond its walls. This explained why previous tenants had experienced such intense phenomena, but neighbors reported nothing unusual. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a vessel, and I was living inside it. Each revelation made the house feel more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing heavier with each passing day. I found myself avoiding convergence points, though the entity seemed to enjoy herding me toward them. It would create distractions elsewhere in the house, loud crashes, sudden temperature drops, then cut off my escape routes until I had no choice but to pass through one of the dangerous areas. These encounters left me shaken, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. Thomas warned me about burning out, about letting fear consume me completely. "You're dealing with something ancient and powerful," he cautioned during one of our increasingly frequent meetings. "But it's not invincible. Knowledge is your best weapon." Still, I could see the worry in his eyes, the way he hesitated before entering the house when we reviewed recordings or examined new evidence. He believed me, trusted my observations, But that didn't mean he wasn't afraid too. By the end of the week, I could predict the entity's movements with disturbing accuracy. It followed a precise schedule, building tension throughout the evening before unleashing its full power after midnight. The manifestations always started in the study, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. I began timing them, documenting every detail in hopes of finding a weakness. But with each passing night, the entity grew stronger, its presence more palpable, its intentions clearer. The house had become a living thing, its heartbeat synchronized with mine. The entity knew my fears, my secrets, my regrets. It whispered them in the dark, twisted them into nightmares as the entity's intelligence revealed itself in increasingly sophisticated ways. It began anticipating my movements, appearing in rooms just as I entered them, creating illusions that played on my deepest insecurities. One evening, as I prepared dinner, I turned to find my reflection in the kitchen window, but it wasn't alone. Standing behind me was a perfect replica of my ex-husband, his face, contorted in anger, mouthing words I couldn't hear. When I spun around, the room was empty, yet the reflection remained, reaching out toward me until I smashed the window with a chair. Sleep became impossible. Each night, the entity would manifest in different forms. Sometimes as shadowy figures pacing the halls, other times as disembodied voices whispering accusations from the darkness. The worst were the dreams that felt too real, where I'd wake up only to discover I was still dreaming, trapped in layers of nightmare reality. In one particularly vivid episode, I found myself standing in my childhood bedroom, watching helplessly as the walls bled and the furniture twisted into grotesque shapes. The entity's laughter echoed in my ears, promising that this was just the beginning. I began experiencing physical symptoms that couldn't be explained away. Bruises appeared on my arms and legs without cause, their patterns matching the symbols from the study walls. My reflection in mirrors would lag behind my movements, sometimes continuing to move when I stood still. The worst was the feeling of being touched. Cold fingers tracing my skin, unseen hands gripping my shoulders, pressure on the bed beside me at night. Tom has confirmed these experiences matched accounts from previous tenants, though none had documented them in such detail. The house's transformation accelerated dramatically. Rooms changed dimensions overnight. Hallways stretched impossibly long, and doors led to unexpected destinations. Once, I opened the front door to find myself facing the backyard instead of the street. Another time, the bathroom mirror reflected a completely different room, one that didn't exist in the house's current layout. The entity seemed to be rewriting reality itself, bending the house's structure to its will. Audio recordings captured during these episodes revealed patterns I hadn't noticed before. Beneath the obvious noises, footsteps, whispers, crashes, lay a constant background hum that matched the frequency of the crystals I'd found. When I played the recordings backward, distinct phrases emerged in multiple languages, all translating to variations of leave or run. The entity's patience was wearing thin, its messages growing more urgent and threatening. Temperature fluctuations became extreme enough to affect the house's infrastructure. Pipes burst regularly, releasing water that froze instantly upon contact with the air. Electrical systems overloaded, causing lights to flash in Morse code patterns that spelled out warnings when decoded. The heating system would alternate between sweltering heat and Arctic cold, sometimes within seconds, creating condensation that formed hieroglyphic-like patterns on the walls. My research uncovered disturbing connections between the entity's behavior and quantum physics theories. The house seemed to exist in a state of superposition, simultaneously occupying multiple realities. Objects would appear in two places at once, shadows cast from impossible angles, and time itself seemed to stretch and compress unpredictably. Thompson's journals hinted at this phenomenon, describing how the entity manipulated probability fields to create its manifestations. The entity's psychological warfare intensified. It began recreating traumatic events from my past with horrifying accuracy, forcing me to relive them in real time. During one particularly devastating episode, I found myself back in the courtroom where my divorce was finalized, surrounded by spectral versions of everyone involved. The entity manipulated their actions and words, twisting the memory into something far worse than reality. When I finally broke free from the illusion, I discovered hours had passed in what felt like minutes. Thomas helped me develop countermeasures, though their effectiveness diminished rapidly. We created complex wards using combinations of salt, iron, and protective symbols, but the entity learned to bypass them almost immediately. Electronic interference devices provided temporary relief, but the entity adapted by manifesting through non-electronic means. The only consistent defense proved to be constant movement. Remaining in any one place for too long invited stronger manifestations. Physical evidence of the entity's presence accumulated rapidly. Photographs showed distortions that couldn't be explained by technical error. Faces in windows where none should be. Figures standing just out of frame. Objects floating mid-air. Video footage captured impossible phenomena. Walls rippling like water, gravity reversing momentarily, and time-lapse sequences showing the house reconstructing itself overnight. Each piece of evidence added to the overwhelming proof that something fundamentally unnatural inhabited the space. The most disturbing development came when I discovered the entity could influence living creatures. Local wildlife began behaving erratically. Birds flying into windows repeatedly. Squirrels attacking their own reflections. Neighborhood pets refusing to come near the house. Even insects seemed affected, forming patterns in the air that matched the entity's symbols. Once, I found dozens of spiders weaving a web that perfectly replicated the house's floor plan, complete with intricate details of rooms that shouldn't exist. My body began betraying me under the constant stress. Sleep deprivation caused hallucinations that blurred the line between reality and manifestation. Adrenaline surges left me shaking uncontrollably, while periods of profound exhaustion made simple tasks impossible. Despite eating regularly, I lost weight rapidly, my reflection growing gaunt with each passing day. Thomas expressed increasing concern, urging me to leave the house, but I knew the entity would follow. The journals confirmed it had done so before. The house's infrastructure started failing systematically. Floorboards warped and split, releasing clouds of noxious gas that smelled of rotting flesh. Wallpaper peeled away to reveal underlying structures that shouldn't exist. Angles too sharp, materials too advanced for the house's age. The very air seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy, creating pressure headaches and making it difficult to focus. Each morning brought new changes, new challenges, new terrors that pushed me closer to my breaking point. As the threshold event approached, the entity's manifestations grew more coordinated. It would orchestrate elaborate scenarios involving multiple rooms, manipulating environmental factors to create immersive experiences that left me questioning reality. Lights would flash in sequence, temperatures would shift in waves, and sound would travel through the house in patterns that defied physics. The entity had become a conductor of chaos, using the house as its instrument and me as its unwilling audience. The archives of the county records office yielded more than I expected. Buried among dusty property deeds and yellowed newspaper clippings was a comprehensive history of the house's dark legacy. The original owner, Silas Greaves, wasn't just an eccentric architect, but a practitioner of obscure mysticism whose work had been condemned by the church. His designs incorporated elements from various esoteric traditions, creating spaces that bent natural laws and facilitated communication with other realms. The house's foundation stones, taken from an ancient burial site, had been specifically chosen for their metaphysical properties. Through meticulous cross-referencing, I uncovered a pattern of disappearances dating back to the house's construction in 1842. Workers vanished without trace. Their tools left exactly where they'd been working. Neighbors reported seeing figures in the windows late at night, though Greaves lived alone. The first recorded death occurred when a young maid, hired to clean the newly completed house, was found catatonic in the basement, mumbling about the watchers in the walls. She died 3 days later, still unable to speak coherently. The house changed hands several times before the Thompsons purchased it in 1907, each owner experienced increasingly disturbing phenomena, though few reported them publicly. Property records showed rapid turnovers, with sales often finalized under duress. One owner, a prominent banker, sold the house for a fraction of its value after claiming to have witnessed his deceased wife walking through walls. Another, a schoolteacher, abandoned everything to flee the state after students reported seeing her in class while she was supposedly at home sick. Newspaper articles from the early 1900s painted a chilling picture of the Thompsons' tenure. Neighbors complained about strange lights and noises emanating from the house at all hours. Delivery men refused to approach the property after reporting sightings of shadowy figures watching them from upper windows. Most telling were the anonymous letters published in the local paper, written by someone claiming to be Ezekiel Thompson himself, warning about the dangers of tampering with forces beyond human comprehension. The library's Special Collections Department held a treasure trove of information. Old Town records documented numerous complaints about the house, including reports of livestock dying mysteriously and crops failing within a quarter-mile radius. Church records showed increased attendance during the Thompsons' occupation, with parishioners seeking protection from evil influences. Several ministers had attempted to perform exorcisms, though their efforts reportedly made matters worse. Thomas helped me connect these historical accounts with modern paranormal research. We discovered that the house's location corresponded to several ley lines, natural energy pathways that practitioners of earth magic considered sacred. The combination of these lines with the burial site stones created a nexus of power that Greaves had deliberately exploited in his design. The angles of certain walls aligned with astrological constellations associated with gateways between worlds, while the overall structure mirrored ancient temple layouts meant to contain supernatural forces. The most significant breakthrough came when I found correspondence between Ezekiel Thompson and various occult societies. These letters detailed his growing obsession with contacting his deceased family members and his gradual descent into madness. He described how the house seemed to amplify his psychic abilities while simultaneously attracting unwanted attention from entities that dwell in the spaces between. His writings grew increasingly paranoid, warning about the watcher that observed his every move through reflections and shadows. Property tax records revealed something even more disturbing. The house's assessed value had remained consistent throughout its history, despite extensive renovations and additions. More importantly, the legal description of the property boundaries kept changing, sometimes encompassing neighboring lots, other times shrinking to exclude parts of the existing structure. It was as if the house itself determined its own dimensions, independent of human measurement. Interviews with elderly residents provided additional insights. Mrs. Hargrove, when pressed, admitted to witnessing strange occurrences herself. Lights moving through empty rooms, figures appearing in windows, sudden temperature drops that affected only the house. Other longtime residents shared similar stories, though most had dismissed them as local lore until my arrival reignited interest in the property's history. Several mentioned how previous tenants had attempted to renovate or remodel, only to abandon projects halfway through, claiming the house resisted changes. The entity's intelligence manifested in its ability to manipulate these historical elements. It would recreate scenes from the house's past, forcing me to witness events firsthand. I found myself standing in the original parlor, watching Silas Greaves perform rituals that made the air shimmer like heat waves. The experience felt so real that I could smell the incense. The entity's manifestations escalated into a symphony of terror that left me questioning my sanity. Each night became a battle for survival, both physical and mental. The house transformed into an active participant in the horror, its very structure shifting and warping to accommodate the entity's growing power. Walls would ripple like water when touched, doorways stretched impossibly tall, and the floorboards developed a pattern of cracks that formed new symbols each morning. I began documenting the entity's behavior in real time, keeping detailed notes on how it manipulated the environment. The temperature fluctuations followed precise sequences. First a gradual cooling, then an abrupt drop to freezing, followed by waves of intense heat that made the air shimmer. These changes corresponded to specific atmospheric conditions outside, suggesting the entity drew power from natural weather patterns. Storms brought particularly violent activity, with lightning strikes somehow channeling energy directly into the house's structure. The psychological warfare intensified to unbearable levels. The entity learned to manifest memories I'd completely forgotten, bringing them to life with devastating accuracy. Once, I found myself back in my college dorm room during finals week, surrounded by versions of myself at different ages. Each one represented a failure or regret, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of self-recrimination. When I tried to leave, the door melted away, trapping me in an endless loop of academic pressure and personal disappointment. Physical contact became more frequent and invasive. Invisible hands would grip my arms with bruising force, leaving marks that matched the symbols from the study walls. My hair would be pulled from behind, though no one stood there when I turned. The most disturbing incidents involved what felt like fingers tracing patterns on my skin while I slept, sometimes spelling out words in ancient languages I couldn't understand but somehow recognized as warnings. Thomas helped me develop a system of environmental monitoring that went beyond simple audio and video recording. We set up sensors to track electromagnetic fluctuations, air pressure changes, and even subtle variations in gravity. The data revealed patterns that aligned perfectly with Thompson's descriptions of the threshold event. Energy spikes occurred at regular intervals, growing stronger and closer together. The house itself seemed to resonate with these pulses, its foundation stones vibrating in harmony with some unseen force. Personal belongings became conduits for the entity's influence. Photographs changed overnight, showing people who had never existed or depicting impossible scenarios. Books would open to specific pages containing passages highlighted in blood red ink. My phone displayed messages from unknown numbers, each containing fragments of text that, when combined, formed coherent sentences in languages long dead. Even my own handwriting began to change, words appearing on paper that I couldn't remember writing. Sleep deprivation took a severe toll on my body. Hallucinations bled into waking hours, making it impossible to distinguish reality from manifestation. Shadows moved independently of light sources, forming shapes that watched me from corners of rooms. Reflections lagged behind actual movements, sometimes continuing actions after I'd stopped. Mirrors became dangerous, showing alternate versions of reality where minor choices had led to drastically different outcomes. The house's infrastructure began failing systematically. Plumbing systems would reverse flow, filling sinks with black water that smelled of decay. Electrical circuits overloaded randomly, creating fire hazards that somehow never ignited. The heating system alternated between Arctic cold and sweltering heat, creating condensation that spelled out warnings on windows and walls. Floorboards warped and split, releasing clouds of noxious gas that burned my lungs and blurred my vision. My research uncovered disturbing parallels between my experiences and accounts of possession in various cultures. The entity's behavior matched descriptions of intelligent hauntings worldwide, manifestations that learned and adapted, psychological manipulation that exploited personal weaknesses, physical interactions that defied explanation. What set this case apart was the scale and sophistication of the phenomena, suggesting we were dealing with something far older and more powerful than typical paranormal entities. The final pieces of Thompson's ritual came together through careful examination of the hidden room beneath the study. Each artifact served a specific purpose. The crystals disrupted energy fields. The herbs neutralized toxic influences. The sigils created protective barriers. But the true key lay in the blackened candle on the pedestal. Its wax contained traces of multiple elements associated with containment spells, while the wick glowed faintly with an inner light that pulsed in time with the house's vibrations. As the threshold event approached, the entity's manifestations grew more coordinated and purposeful. It orchestrated elaborate scenarios involving multiple rooms, manipulating environmental factors to create immersive experiences that left me questioning reality. Lights flashed in complex patterns that matched quantum wave functions. Temperatures shifted in waves that corresponded to brainwave frequencies, and sounds traveled to the house in sequences that spelled out warnings in binary code. Thomas warned me about the dangers of attempting the sealing ritual without proper preparation. These things are like predators, he explained, helping me organize the necessary components. They'll pretend to be weaker than they are, luring you into false confidence. We developed contingency plans for every possible scenario, though both of us knew that once the threshold event began, conventional measures would likely prove ineffective. The days leading up to the event felt like walking through quicksand. Time stretched and compressed unpredictably, hours passed in what felt like minutes or vice versa. Physical objects gained and lost weight inexplicably, making even simple tasks challenging. My reflection aged visibly in mirrors, showing decades passing in moments, while clocks throughout the house displayed different times simultaneously. Reality itself seemed to fray at the edges, revealing glimpses of something vast and incomprehensible waiting just beyond perception. Despite all precautions, I could feel the entity preparing for its final move. The house vibrated with pent-up energy, every surface charged with potential threat. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, merging into solid forms that watched silently from corners. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest with increasing force. Whatever was coming, it would require everything I had, and possibly more, to survive. The clock struck midnight, but the chime sounded distorted, stretched thin like taffy being pulled apart. The house responded instantly, every surface trembling with barely contained energy. The grandfather clock in the hallway began spinning backward, its pendulum moving faster and faster, until it blurred into invisibility. A low hum filled the air, resonating through my bones and making my teeth ache. This wasn't just sound, it was vibration at a fundamental level, like the universe itself was shaking loose from its moorings. Temperature fluctuations became violent and unpredictable. One moment, I was sweating profusely as the air heated to sound-alike conditions. The next, I was shivering uncontrollably as frost spread across the walls in intricate patterns that spelled out words and languages I couldn't read but somehow understood. The cold wasn't natural. It penetrated clothing and skin, reaching deep into my core like liquid nitrogen coursing through my veins. Lighting died throughout the house, plunging rooms into darkness that seemed thicker than normal. Emergency flashlights flickered erratically, their beams bending and twisting as if passing through water. The few functioning lights cast shadows that moved independently of their sources, stretching and contorting into impossible angles. Some shadows detached completely, becoming solid forms that prowled the halls, their movements jerky and unnatural. Sounds assaulted me from every direction, whispers in dozens of languages overlapping in a deafening chorus, footsteps pounding in perfect rhythm despite nothing visible moving, crashes and bangs that shook the foundation, yet left no visible damage. Beneath it all ran a constant background noise like static electricity, occasionally resolving into clear words that cut through the chaos. Leave, run, end. The entity's presence manifested physically now, no longer content with subtle manipulations. Walls rippled and bulged outward, forming temporary protrusions that resembled faces screaming in agony before melting back into flat surfaces. Floorboards buckled and split, releasing clouds of noxious gas that smelled of rotting flesh and burning hair. Ceiling fixtures swung wildly, their chains clinking in complex patterns that spelled out warnings in Morse code. In the study, the convergence point had become a swirling vortex of energy, visible only in peripheral vision. Direct observation caused searing pain behind my eyes and immediate nausea. Objects orbiting the vortex moved in impossible trajectories, defying gravity and physics. Papers floated upward only to freeze midair, rearranging themselves into new configurations that formed coherent messages when viewed from certain angles. My body reacted violently to the escalating phenomena. Heart palpitations made it difficult to breathe, while waves of dizziness forced me to crawl rather than walk. My skin crawled with a sensation of insects burrowing beneath the surface, though visual inspection showed nothing. Blood trickled from my nose and ears, joining other unexplained injuries. Deep bruises matching occult symbols, fingernail scratches appearing overnight, and strange burns that formed patterns on my skin. Reality itself fractured around me. Doorways led unexpected destinations. One moment opening into familiar rooms, the next revealing landscapes that couldn't exist. Time flowed inconsistently, with hours passing and seconds or minutes stretching into eternity. Objects appeared doubled or tripled, existing in multiple states simultaneously. Mirrors showed alternate versions of events, some terrifying, others tantalizingly peaceful, all equally unreal. The entity communicated more directly now, its voice emerging from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Words formed in my mind without sound, carrying emotions and images that overwhelmed my senses. It showed me visions of previous tenants' final moments, some fleeing in terror, others succumbing to madness, all trapped in endless loops of despair. These weren't mere memories. They felt current, happening right now in parallel dimensions. Physical manifestations reached new heights of horror. Shadow figures materialized fully, their forms constantly shifting between human and something else entirely. They moved with impossible grace, passing through walls and furniture as if they weren't there. Their eyes glowed with internal light, tracking my movements with predatory focus. When they spoke, their voices layered over each other, creating harmonies that vibrated through my skull. Environmental effects grew more extreme. Water flowed uphill through pipes, collecting in pools that hovered midair before evaporating instantly. Electrical outlets sparked continuously, creating small fires that extinguished themselves before spreading. Air pressure fluctuated wildly, sometimes crushing inward with enough force to crack plaster, other times expanding outward so rapidly that windows shattered. The house's architecture mutated dramatically. Rooms expanded and contracted without warning, hallways twisted into impossible geometries, and ceilings rose or fell unpredictably. Staircases changed direction midway, leading to unexpected destinations. Entire sections of the house disappeared temporarily, reappearing later with altered layouts or missing features. Doors open onto brick walls or empty space where rooms should be. Psychological attacks intensified to unbearable levels. Memories surfaced unbidden, playing out in vivid detail, while current reality faded into background noise. Personal failures and regrets manifested physically. Ghostly versions of myself at different ages appeared, criticizing choices and magnifying mistakes. The entity weaponized my own thoughts against me, amplifying doubts and fears until they threatened to consume me completely. Amidst this chaos, the ritual components responded uniquely. Crystals vibrated with increasing intensity, their glow bright enough to cause retinal burn if stared at too long. Herbs released potent aromas that shifted between pleasant and nauseating depending on proximity to convergence points. Sigils etched into walls pulsed with light, their patterns changing dynamically in response to environmental shifts. The blackened candle remained the epicenter of activity, its flame guttering but never extinguishing despite the supernatural storm raging around it. Time lost all meaning as the threshold event progressed. What felt like hours might have been minutes. What seemed instantaneous could have spanned days. The entity's influence saturated every molecule of air, every fiber of the house's structure, every thought in my mind. Reality and unreality merged into a single, overwhelming experience that defied description or comprehension. All I knew for certain was that something monumental approached, a culmination of forces that would either destroy everything or transform it forever. Chapter 10, Beyond the Veil. The entity's true form emerged gradually, like developing film in a darkroom. At first, it was just a distortion in the air, a heat haze that refused to dissipate. Then came the eyes, hundreds of them opening simultaneously throughout the house, watching from walls, ceilings, and floors. They weren't human eyes. Their pupils dilated vertically like a cat's but glowed with internal light, casting sickly green illumination that made shadows dance unnaturally. Its body materialized piece by piece, each component more horrifying than the last. Tentacles formed from shadow stuff writhed along the walls, their surfaces covered in constantly shifting symbols that matched those carved into the study walls. These appendages ended in clusters of finger-like projections that tapped out complex rhythms against surfaces, creating vibrations that resonated to the house's structure. Sometimes they would reach out toward me, their touch colder than any winter wind, leaving trails of frost that spelled out warnings in multiple languages. The central mass of the entity defied description, a writhing amalgamation of darkness and light that pulsed like a living thing. Within its depths, I could see countless faces screaming silently, their features blending and separating in endless combinations. Limbs emerged and retreated constantly, some humanoid, others resembling insectoid claws or serpentine coils. The entire form radiated an aura of wrongness that made my skin crawl and my stomach churn with primal fear. Communication evolved beyond mere words or images. The entity projected emotions directly into my consciousness, waves of despair so intense they brought me to my knees, bursts of euphoria that left me disoriented and confused, spikes of rage that made my hands shake uncontrollably. These emotional assaults came in rapid succession, creating a psychological roller coaster that left me vulnerable and exposed. More disturbing were the memories it forced me to relive. Not just my own, but those of previous victims. Their final moments played out in vivid detail, while I remained trapped as both observer and participant. Physical interaction became more aggressive and calculated. The tentacles learned to manipulate objects with precision, using them as weapons or tools. Furniture flew through the air, breaking apart mid-flight to create projectiles that narrowly missed my head. The entity discovered it could affect my body directly. Muscles locked up without warning, joints twisted painfully, and once, my heart stopped beating for several terrifying seconds before restarting with a painful jolt. Each attack pushed me closer to the edge of consciousness, testing how much trauma my body could endure before shutting down completely. Environmental manipulation reached apocalyptic levels. The house's structure flexed and twisted like it was alive, creating spaces that shouldn't exist geometrically. Rooms folded in on themselves, creating impossible angles and dimensions. Gravity shifted randomly, sometimes pulling downward with crushing force, other times reversing completely or operating at angles perpendicular to normal orientation. Air pressure fluctuated wildly, creating sonic booms that rattled windows and sent shockwaves through the building. The entity demonstrated intelligence far beyond anything I'd encountered before. It learned from each interaction, adapting its tactics with frightening speed. Attempts to use protective wards resulted in the symbols being absorbed into its form, strengthening rather than repelling it. Electronic interference devices created feedback loops that amplified its power instead of dampening it. Even attempts to flee were anticipated. Doors sealed themselves shut, windows became impenetrable surfaces, and exit routes led back to the starting point. Most chilling was its ability to manipulate reality itself. Solid objects passed through walls like ghosts, only to regain solidity elsewhere. Time loops trapped me in repeating scenarios that grew increasingly horrific with each iteration. Alternate versions of myself appeared, some trying to help, others working against me, all equally real and equally fake. The boundary between physical and metaphysical dissolved completely, leaving me adrift in a sea of possibilities where nothing could be trusted. Sensory overload became constant. Sounds layered upon each other in complex patterns that carried hidden meanings when decoded properly. Smells shifted from pleasant to putrid in seconds, sometimes emanating from empty air. Taste filled my mouth without eating, metallic blood, sweet decay, bitter ash. Touch sensations multiplied exponentially, feeling 10 different textures simultaneously while standing on smooth wooden floor. Sight became unreliable, with colors bleeding into each other and shapes morphing constantly. The entity's hunger manifested physically. It drained vitality from the environment, causing plants to wither instantly, food to rot within seconds, and batteries to discharge completely. Living creatures caught in its influence aged rapidly or deteriorated before my eyes. Once, I watched a fly land on a windowsill and crumble to dust in minutes. The process accelerated when directed at me. My reflection showed rapid aging, hair turning white, skin wrinkling, eyes sinking into sockets. Despite the overwhelming terror, patterns emerged in chaos. The entity operated according to rules I couldn't fully comprehend, but could sometimes predict. Its movements followed mathematical progressions. Its manifestations aligned with astrological events, and its power ebbed and flowed with lunar cycles. These patterns suggested vulnerability, not weakness exactly, but moments when its control slipped slightly, allowing brief windows of opportunity. The final revelation came when I realized the entity needed me as much as it wanted to destroy me. Through its assault, I became aware of another presence, a consciousness buried deep within its form, trapped and screaming for release. This secondary entity communicated through feelings rather than words. Gratitude when I resisted, despair when I faltered, hope when I fought back. Somehow, my presence had created a fracture in its prison, giving it a chance to break free. As dawn approached, the entity gathered itself for one final assault. Its form stabilized into something almost beautiful, a crystalline structure of darkness and light that filled the entire house. The symbols on its surface glowed brighter, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. Tentacles withdrew into its mass, concentrating power into a single, massive form that loomed above me like a thundercloud about to break. The air crackled with energy, and I knew whatever happened next would decide not just my fate, but potentially the fate of everyone and everything connected to this place. The entity launched its final assault with devastating precision. Its crystalline form shattered into countless shards, each one embedding itself into the house's structure. Walls became translucent, revealing the writhing mass within. The air thickened until breathing required conscious effort. Each inhalation tasting of ozone and decay. My body convulsed involuntarily as invisible forces tore at my muscles, my nervous system firing randomly like exposed wires. Reality fractured completely. Multiple versions of the house existed simultaneously. Some intact, others crumbling into ruin, some transformed into alien geometries that hurt to look at. Time loops trapped me in infinite repetitions of my worst memories, each cycle more painful than the last. The entity's voice filled every space, speaking in thousands of languages simultaneously, each word carrying the weight of centuries of suffering. I collapsed against the wall, my strength failing as the entity drained my vitality. My vision tunneled, focusing on the blackened candle still standing in the center of the room. Its flame danced erratically, casting shadows that spelled out a single word repeatedly. Choose. Understanding hit me like a physical blow. The entity wasn't just attacking. It was offering a bargain. Power in exchange for servitude, knowledge for submission, escape from pain for eternal imprisonment. Summoning the last reserves of my willpower, I crawled toward the candle. Each movement felt like pushing through molasses, the entity's influence pressing down with crushing force. The symbols on the walls blazed with renewed intensity, their patterns shifting to match my progress. Tentacles reached out, brushing against my skin with icy touch that left trails of frost spelling out warnings. Stop, turn back, accept. Reaching the pedestal, I grasped the candle's base. Instantly, visions flooded my mind. Thompson's final moments, the entity's origin as a guardian twisted into predator, the countless souls trapped within its form. Most importantly, I saw the fracture I created, the tiny crack in its prison that widened with each moment I resisted. The secondary presence within begged for release, its desperation overwhelming my own fear. Using the candle as a focus, I began reciting the sealing ritual's incantation. The words came unbidden, flowing from some deep well of ancestral memory. Each syllable caused the entity to recoil, its crystalline form vibrating with contained fury. Symbols on the walls flared brighter, their patterns aligning with the ritual's progression. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, every surface charged with potential energy. The entity attacked with everything it had left. Reality splintered into fragments, each shard showing a different version of my death. Pain became a constant companion, every nerve ending screaming in protest. Yet something kept me going, the realization that I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. The trapped consciousness within the entity's form reached out, lending me strength through our shared determination to end this cycle of torment. As I completed the final phrase, the house's foundation stones began to vibrate in harmony. The crystal scattered throughout the room pulsed with synchronized light, creating a network of energy that flowed through the sigils and into the candle. The entity's form destabilized, its crystalline structure fracturing further. Tentacles lashed out wildly, smashing through walls and ceilings in its desperation to maintain control. Then came the moment of truth. The secondary presence surged forward, using the ritual's power to break free. For a brief instant, I saw its true form, a being of pure light and compassion, ancient and wise beyond measure. It reached out to the entity, not with violence but with understanding, offering redemption instead of destruction. The two forms merged in a blinding flash that erased everything from view. When awareness returned, I found myself lying on the study floor. The house was silent, its oppressive atmosphere replaced by normal silence. The walls bore no symbols. The air smelled clean, and morning light streamed through intact windows. Only the blackened candle remained, its flame extinguished but wick still warm to the touch. Thomas found me hours later, curled up beside the pedestal. He helped me to my feet, his face pale with concern. "Did it work?" he asked softly. I could only nod, too exhausted to speak. Together, we searched the house, finding no trace of supernatural influence. The hidden rooms had vanished. The convergence points felt ordinary, and even the lingering chill in the basement had disappeared. Yet something remained, a sense of watchful presence, neither threatening nor comforting, but simply there, like the house itself remembered everything that had happened and waited patiently for what came next. As I packed my belongings under Thomas's concerned gaze, I couldn't shake the feeling that while we contained the entity, we hadn't truly banished it. Something fundamental had changed in the fabric of reality here, leaving ripples that extended far beyond these walls. The drive away from the house proved surreal. Each mile marker pass felt like shedding another layer of nightmare, yet the memories remained vivid. My hands still trembled from exhaustion, and dark circles under my eyes testified to sleepless nights. Thomas had offered a spare room, but I declined. Some instinct told me distance was necessary, that staying in town might draw the entity's attention again. Pulling into a motel parking lot 3 towns over, I noticed something odd. The radio tuned itself to static, just like back at the house. Shaking my head, I convinced myself it was coincidence, fatigue playing tricks on my mind. But as I climbed out of the car, the air smelled faintly of lavender and decay, and the room's temperature dropped noticeably despite the summer heat. Inside, I couldn't settle. Every sound, the heater clicking on, the ice machine dispensing cubes, cars passing outside, triggered memories of the house. Shadows seemed longer than they should be, and reflections in the bathroom mirror lagged behind my movements. Sleep proved impossible. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the entity's crystalline form hovering just out of reach, its eyes glowing with unreadable intent. The next morning, I woke to find my journal open on the bedside table, pages flipping rapidly despite the absence of wind. Settling on a blank page, words began appearing in my handwriting. It's not done. Panic rising, I slammed the book shut and stuffed it into my bag. Checking out the motel, I drove aimlessly, putting more miles between myself and that cursed place. Days turned into weeks. I found temporary housing in a city apartment, surrounded by noise and life that should have drowned out memories of the house. But the entity's influence lingered. Lights flickered when I entered rooms. Neighbors complained about strange noises coming from my unit despite my silence. Once, I caught a glimpse of myself in a store window. Behind my reflection stood a figure that looked disturbingly like Ezekiel Thompson, his expression both warning and pleading. Thomas called regularly, updating me on the house's status. New tenants had moved in briefly, but fled after a single night, claiming the place was wrong. Real estate agents reported difficulties showing the property. Potential buyers would suddenly lose interest without explanation. Most troubling were reports of increased paranormal activity in neighboring houses, as if the entity's influence was spreading beyond its original boundaries. Research became an obsession. I pored over occult texts, cross-referencing accounts of similar entities and their methods of containment. Patterns emerged that chill me to the bone. Instances where sealing rituals had merely delayed rather than destroyed, cases where entities had adapted to their prisons, growing stronger with each failed attempt at banishment. The house had been a focal point, yes, but perhaps not the source. One night, unable to sleep, I reviewed the recordings from the house. Playing them at different speeds revealed something I had missed before, a pattern of whispers that, when isolated and reversed, formed a countdown. The numbers corresponded to dates, each one marking significant increases in paranormal activity in the surrounding area. The final date was approaching rapidly, just weeks away. Panic gave way to grim determination. If the entity wasn't truly contained, if its influence continued spreading, then running wouldn't solve anything. I began gathering resources, reaching out to experts in paranormal phenomena, and documenting everything I'd experienced in meticulous detail. The house had taught me much about fear, but also about resilience and the importance of facing one's demons, literal or otherwise. As I prepared to return to the town, to confront whatever waited in that house, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The entity's defeat, if it could even be called that, had opened something wider than before. Other presences stirred in the darkness, drawn by what had transpired. The house at the end of the road remained patient and watchful, its walls whispering secrets to anyone who would listen. The final chapter remains unwritten, the story unfinished. Perhaps it always will be, evolving with each person who encounters it, adapting to new circumstances and vulnerabilities. As I pack my bags for the return journey, I know one thing for certain. The house isn't done with me. And I'm not done with it. Whatever comes next will test everything I've learned, everything I've survived, and somewhere in the deepest recesses of reality, something ancient and hungry waits, listening to the whispers of those who dare to challenge the darkness.